With most card games following some sort of live service or expansion cycle model, we become keenly aware that the power levels of tools players have at their disposals tend to increase over time. This trend is present in other games as well, like MMOs, but I find power creep, as that's what we're talking about here, is especially interesting in the context of card games as compared to other genres of games. The genre itself seems to ooze influence onto the concept, making some aspects of it way more interesting. And we will be mostly concentrating on these. I'm Simon from Games Deconstructed, and this is the Power Creep video. Getting the definition out of the way, I consider power creep to be an infusion of more power than was previously available into a game's systems that specifically has a negative effect on player enjoyment. So by my definition, there can be no good power creep. Though I agree that there are some power increases over time that can have a neutral or arguably even positive effect. I will be referring to these as power infusions without bringing the creep factor into it, which is something I aspire to in all areas of my life. In most card games, at least competitive ones, cards and card designs by extension are in competition with one another or each other. I can never tell the difference. Every new card being printed has the chance to supplant the worst card in your deck. So for a competitively minded player, instances of power creep will bring the need to make changes to their deck. And in card games where community-based optimization processes are pretty advanced, like Hearthstone with its deck tracker-based win rate tiers and weekly expert meta reports, even small changes to the power curve brought upon by power creep will carry that risk. So far, that's pretty in line with what we see in other genres like MMOs. When a new item set for mage drops in the newest expansion, you will need to gear your mage up. You will not want to be stuck with whatever was best in slot last expansion, but would much rather use the new hotness. However, decks, unlike mage item sets for most players at least, are a form of expression of player preference. That works both on a playstyle level. For example, I may enjoy this deck because it messes with my opponent's hand, it features a lot of discard, and I'm a gremlin who enjoys that sort of thing. And I may also enjoy the aesthetic component of the deck. I might like that those discard effects are mostly printed on spooky specters and spirits and various other apparitions. If optimal choices get printed that mess with that perception of mine, if the newly printed discard card is no longer a spirit, or the newly printed spirit is no longer a discard card, I will feel like I have to make an optimal gameplay choice to include that new hotness, but at the same time it will no longer allow me to express myself to the same degree. However, the need to change cards in your deck brings us to the elephant in the room, a much bigger consideration, and that's the monetary aspect of card games. Most card games, paper perhaps to a further degree than digital, requires some form of investment. And whenever you have to make changes to your deck, it runs the risk of making your previous purchases feel invalidated. This may be especially hurtful to players who flock to non-rotating formats, since if you're buying into Standard, you are kind of accepting that these cards will eventually become obsolete. But if you've just spent a couple of $100 to buy into Modern, and you are informed that now you need to replace your $50 single with a newly printed, perhaps $25 single, that's probably going to be a bad thing if you expected that deck to serve you unchanged for multiple years. And since power level is an element of the game that designers have or seem to have control over, it's very easy to find an undertone of malicious intent. For example, one of the best-selling Magic sets of all time is Modern Horizons 2, a set that was also very, very powerful. And I don't think it's that far-fetched to consider that one of the motivations behind making these cards printed straight into a non-rotating formats as powerful as they were, was monetary. I think it's understood by the companies behind the games we play that stronger cards sell. So that was one avenue along which power infusions may become unfun and as a result, power creep. In short, power creep makes you change your deck, and now you know why that might be bad. Approaching the topic from another perspective, power creep may also bring with it a host of balancing issues. At higher power levels, it may be too difficult to pull on the various balance levers that designers have available. This creates a problem oft called rocket tag, where whoever goes first, whoever gets a threat to stick first, whoever is able to deal damage first, is way more likely to win. Since powerful often overlaps with fast in card games, this presents less space for players to make decisions, because it's difficult to come up with a design that will give you as many decisions to make over 2 turns as over 4. Randomness is another element of card games that requires space to average out. This forms a negative feedback loop with the shorter game lengths, reducing the impact of player decision-making even further. I've got a whole video discussing randomness and random effects. You can see the card on screen right now. If you're enjoying this one, maybe open that up for later. Another problem presents itself when power creep is mostly present on a couple big cards, especially if those are proactive, finisher-like cards. I like to call this one the localization of power. It creates decks and metagames where other pieces will often play second fiddle to those few powerful cards. They will be mostly present in a supportive role, either helping you draw into, cheat out, or otherwise allowing you to play those big beaters. This creates way more linear play patterns because they all end in that one big card being played, and when you only have a single destination, most paths towards it begin to look like lines. You'll win most games attacking with that one card, and that one attacking finisher is going to be the last thing your opponent sees, so it will be way more memorable than the enablers, which in turn creates the perception that it's the only card that matters in your deck, as echoed in the Reddit post on screen right now. Another avenue by which unchecked power creep may create unfun play patterns and the metagames that follow is furthering the differences between optimized and unoptimized decks. Since the results of power creep are often present in confluences of multiple synergistic cards, it furthers the divide between optimal and suboptimal. The cumulative difference in comparing a combo of 3 good cards versus a combo of 3 bad cards may be much larger than when comparing these cards individually one by one. Many players prefer when the differences in matchup odds between starter and meta decks, or F2P versus full collection decks, are more averaged out, 60-40 or perhaps 70-30, with the rest being determined purely by player skill. In some formats, I could show up with a tier 1 deck and have a even nail-biting match against an unsleeved precon if that unsleeved precon was piloted by MTG Hall of Famer Brian Kibler. Power creep emphasizes the differences in card selection, because if you make the conscious decision to put those powerful outlier cards into your deck, you will be rewarded with matchup odds with win percentages. So a heavily power-crept format is going to spell doom for Kibler and his hastily assembled pile of cards. Finally, it's important to recognize that power creep is often a self-propagating problem. It leads to an arms race. If a deck or an archetype is boosted to high levels of popularity via power creep, a very accessible solution is just to print stronger cards in other archetypes. Fight power creep with more power creep. Stronger creature cycles will often lead to stronger answer cycles. That's something we've seen in the history of Magic. But that may cause the aftershock effects that we've talked about previously to spread even further and at a faster rate. So these were the main reasons behind and methods by which power creep negatively influences player perceptions of a game and its formats. But I do have a couple of silver linings and a couple of good practices to also tell you about. First of all, it's theoretically possible for games to be more fun when they're faster, more explosive, higher power level, etc. With power creep having so many negatives, it's very easy to recall the especially egregious examples, the metas that were very unfun, that resulted in a truly prodigious amount of bans, but many card games have been in a more fun place, with the format being a bit higher powered than the low-powered core sets, or whatever the first set in each card game was called. If you are a budding card game designer, I want to let you know that it's entirely possible to include power infusions as part of your expansion plan in an iterative design sort of way, where you create a consciously conservative core experience and transition to an intended higher power level based on concrete data gathered from how players got used to your core set. You might want your game to be in a place of higher power eventually, but not go there immediately straight out the gate, to avoid placing that power in the wrong places, for example, like the least fun archetypes. Even though we spoke of the exact opposite examples, some games can also be easier to balance when the numbers are higher. Balance levers become a bit more granular then, and it's easier to establish varied archetype and card identities without falling into the trap of them being impossible to balance numerically or looking samey because they have the same numbers appear on them. There's a reason why many beginner designers go for higher numbers on cards as a crutch, having them have 1000 HP instead of 10, because the difference between 10 and 9 is huge, and the difference between 1000 and 990 is much smaller. It's genuinely easier from that perspective, and though it's a crutch, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Crutches are useful objects, and you should use them where possible. Especially in paper TCGs, it's impossible or nearly impossible to adjust already printed designs, so if you've made a mistake at some point, introducing a better design is an arguably inelegant but effective way to adjust that. Let's consider Lorcana's Jumba Jukiba versus Virana Fang Chief. It might have been better to just give Emerald a single vanilla 5/5 card in the first place, but printing one in the expansion might be the next best thing. A power infusion is unlikely to become power creep if it happens to a card that's generally unplayable. And introducing these controlled power infusions can of course be part of an ongoing process. Mark Rosewater, the head designer for MTG, describes this using the metaphor of an Escher stairwell, where one aspect of the game gets stronger in an expansion, giving it time to shine, while the other archetypes and mechanics not only appear weaker by comparison, but are also consciously kept weaker. They don't get as many new toys, and that keeps the power level from ever rising too much. So if you're a fan of graveyard mechanics or merfolk, they will get their time in the sun eventually and then get overshadowed by the flavor of the month of the next expansion. The overall power level appears to climb steadily because merfolk have never been so powerful, hence the stairwell metaphor, but it actually stays at a similar level in aggregate, in average, over the long term, hence the inspiration from MC Escher's stairwell because merfolk are going to suck for the next 5 years. I find this to be a very realistic viewpoint. It's difficult to create a game where fans of all aspects of it are going to be equally happy at the same time, so accepting that everyone will get their turn eventually is a nice compromise, kind of the next best thing. But, that's assuming that you're able to judge the effects of your actions properly. Since you are consciously introducing more power into the system each expansion, by design, that creates a very likely failure point in each expansion. If you were ever to misjudge, all those negatives that we talked about could occur. This also works best for rotating formats because you don't have to deal with the consequences of the last time merfolk were powerful 5 years ago, but players in Eternal formats will just take the next best thing you give them, making their decks more optimized, faster and meaner, one card per expansion. Or alternatively, they will not be interested in any of the new cards because they are not more powerful than whatever was printed 5 years ago. There are also some mechanics that only work at a specific power level because they are very binary, very difficult to balance. An example I can think of is Highlander mechanics in Hearthstone that require you to only use a single copy of each card in your deck, as opposed to the usual 2. And that condition is so binary because you can't have half a Highlander deck that you need them to be on a specific power level in terms of their upsides to make up for that deck building limitation. Because you can apply balancing to only half of the equation, only the upside and not the condition, they could theoretically slot better into a stronger or weaker meta. And since power infusions are one means by which you could control the power level of the meta, if you need a more powerful meta to insert your Highlander cards into, power infusions may be the solution you're looking for. Power infusions are also a means by which support is given for older beloved decks. That happens occasionally in Yu-Gi-Oh! For example. Printing new cards to supplant the worst cards in those half-forgotten yet beloved decks runs the risks of asking the players to change those decks that we discussed previously, but it also provides them with opportunities to reuse decks that they grew up loving, as well as to showcase some skills in card selection and deck building, to kind of mold the deck into something that's worthy of inclusion in a newer format. Whenever discussions of power creep happen, there is yet another elephant in this modestly sized room. You guys should come over sometime, by the way, this is a lovely apartment. And that elephant in the room is the definition of strictly better. A strictly better card is a card that's equally or more useful in every imaginable situation that the other card that is being compared to would be, but either cheaper, stronger numerically, or provided with an upside. The definition of what's considered an upside is kind of fuzzy. Magruder, in their article A Conservative Metric of Power Creep, provides an even more conservative definition that has to follow all of these criteria. These definitions, as you might imagine, limit the discussion to a very small subset of cards and trends. It has one big positive: it is objective and can be calculated mathematically to a degree, which Magruder utilizes to calculate power creep across time. But that view shows very little as to how power creep really influences the games we love, because strictly better is by no means an ideal metric. You can print a card that's going to serve as a better version of Warrior's late-game board clear in Hearthstone without it being a strictly better version of an existing one. Hell, there's one in the current Hearthstone expansion, Reno Lone Ranger. It's a novel effect, and as a result is not really comparable with anything we've seen thus far, but it is better than anything else at filling this specific role in the decks that he's played in, to the point of the meta actually revolving around this card, which poses kind of a problem during my current climb to Legend since I don't have him. The sum of multiple situationally better cards, none of them strictly better, will also often synergize into a deck that's considerably higher powered, without any of them needing to be strictly better than their predecessors. I very much dislike limiting discussions of power creep to just strictly better cards. I think it's an attempt to preemptively win a discussion with an annoying troll who will insist Boil isn't better than Boiling Seas because it can be countered by this spell, a rhetorical brace against that bad faith argument. But the processes of power creep and power infusions that we both hate and enjoy, that make the games too fast or just fat enough, too explosive or explosively fun, that consign older cards to oblivion or breathe new life into half-forgotten archetypes, these processes are not driven by printing strictly better cards. They are brought upon by cards like Reno Lone Ranger, by cards that are often better but in new ways, previously unseen, uncomparable to anything we've seen thus far, or by combinations of cards that, though only situationally better individually, meld into a Voltron of a deck that has all of its bases covered. In our State of the Meta discussion, we should not shy away from subjectivity. We should concentrate on these cards, not the easy objective examples. We should not shy away from discussion or disagreement, since power creep and whether it exists in a game, and to what degree it negatively impacts player enjoyment, are all subjective questions. These are not a mathematical optimization problem to be solved, though big props to Magruder for the excellent article, which you can find pinned in the top comment as part of the sources list for this video. Thanks a lot for watching. I've been Simon from Games Deconstructed, and I hope you learned something here. Click one of the YouTube clickables. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you in the next one.